On December 7, 1941, the United States government was put into a state of war hysteria after a fleet of 360 Japanese dive bombers appeared from the sky over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, sinking 15 ships and killing 2,400 Americans. This infamous attack was later named the Battle of Pearl Harbor, and it proved to the government Japan posed a threat to the United States. Consequently, security precautions were taken, including the forced removal of all Japanese Americans. They had only a few days to prepare before they were sent to one of 10 relocation camps located on the West Coast. The incarceration of Japanese Americans presented racism and civil injustice issues, which created a legacy that would impact the lives of future Americans later on.
Shortly after the Battle of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the State Department to investigate the loyalty of Japanese Americans. Special Representative of the State Department, Curtis B. Munson, concluded that there will still be some sabotage from Japanese agents, but otherwise, there is no Japanese problem on the coast. The government ignored Munson's beliefs, as on February 14, 1942, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt recommended the idea of incarcerating all citizens who were at least 1/16 of Japanese descent to President Roosevelt. DeWitt argued it was better to guarantee protection than to risk another attack similar to that of Pearl Harbor. Only 5 days later, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which gave the government authority to forcibly remove over 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes. This was against Japanese Americans' basic rights, and although there was no physical fighting, this was a large ethical conflict. Although the executive order gave the government new responsibilities, it also required that food, shelter, medical aid, and transportation would be provided to the internees. Military commanders also had the power to force compliance to any of these previous rules, meaning that they could coerce any rebelling Japanese Americans into the relocation centers.
As soon as Executive Order 9066 was put into place, civil exclusion orders were gradually posted all around the West Coast. The first document was posted on March 24, 1942, and gave Japanese Americans only 6 days to prepare before they had to bring everything from their own bedding, clothes, kitchenware, and essential personal effects to the camps. Joe Okimoto recalled how he and his family prepared for leaving. We were allowed to take only what we could carry in 2 suitcases that did not include very much property. After a few days of hurried preparation, some internees were brought by government-chartered vehicles to temporary camps put together by the Wartime Civil Control Administration. The temporary camps were located on old fairgrounds, racetracks, and horse stables, where Okimoto recalled how the smell of horse was pervasive.
When traveling to camp, many Japanese Americans were given a one-way ticket and sent to the camp nearest to them. The first people to leave lived on Bainbridge Island, Washington, and left their homes via ferry. One man recalled the walk along Eagledale Dock as the most humiliating moment of his life. In a letter, another internee wrote, "To the people on the island, I would like to say goodbye, and I hope to see you all soon. It's rather hard to write a letter under conditions such as they are now."
Once they arrived at camp, many Japanese American families were left depressed from bad weather, inadequate food, and the large lack of privacy from communal bathrooms, dining halls, and laundry areas. One Nisei wrote, "Our hearts sank to a new low. Even some of the soldiers who escorted us down couldn't believe what they saw. Even though internees tried to continue life as seamlessly as possible, conditions were still harsh and different, and one internee even recalled how the whole family tradition structure was blown apart."
In addition to the conditions of the camps, many Japanese Americans were also forced to abandon their homes, businesses, and crops, some that would have been worth over $250,000 during harvest time. In the final days before he was incarcerated, Sonoji Sakai was forced to hand over his farm to surrogates. His daughter, Kei Sakai Nakao, was 22 when she was sent to Manzanar in California, where the desert conditions made the camps hot and dry. Men in relocation camps were given a questionnaire that was most well known for 2 controversial questions. Will you volunteer for combat? And will you swear allegiance to the U.S. and forswear any obedience to the Japanese emperor? If internees answered no and no for these questions, they could be exiled or sent back to Japan, but former internee Lily Kitamoto Kodama said that some didn't care about the consequences.
If they gave up allegiance to Japan, then they would be people without a country.
The decisions and choices made for how to answer these questions reflected not only onto Japanese Americans' views on the internment, but also onto its legacy.
The Bainbridge Review, a major newspaper at the time, was run by Millie and Walt Woodward and published in Bainbridge Island. The day after Pearl Harbor, they wrote, "There is a danger of a blind, wild, hysterical hatred of all persons who can trace ancestry to Japan. These Japanese Americans of ours haven't bombed anybody. In the past, they have given every indication of loyalty to this nation." The Bainbridge Review was the only popular newspaper in Washington opposing the internment, and it reminded people that the island Japanese were not the enemy, but they had the same constitutional rights as everyone else. The Woodwards believed if this event could happen to Japanese Americans, it could happen to anyone. The newspaper documented experiences and even started reporting people leaving camp in 1943. After the camps dissolved, Japanese Americans began to express wants for vengeance, which led to the redress movement of the 1970s. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter gave a speech about providing civil service retirement credit to internees, but many believe this was only partial compensation. Carter told the country that the loyalty and devotion of our Japanese American citizens, despite government action, has been proven many times over. On August 10, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which gave $20,000 to each of the 60,000 survivors. When giving them their rectification, he emphasized that no payment could be made up for the years they had lost. There was a general consensus among the Japanese Americans that the government admitting their wrong was more important than the money received. Terry Shima, a Japanese American who later fought in World War II, recalled how, "To me, it represents the greatness of America. The government recognized it had made a huge mistake and apologized for it. No other nation would have done that."
When President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, he compromised the rights and livelihood of Japanese Americans and created, according to some historians, one of the most flagrant violations of civil liberties in American history. According to Katie Curtis from the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum, although they thought it was wrong, the Japanese Americans compromised with the government and went to camp peacefully and without violent protest. A former internee, George Tatashi, said, "There were no complaints, no big rallies or demands for justice, because it was not the Japanese way." The Japanese Americans agreed to go to camp, and the government agreed to provide resources and transportation. After the redress movement, when President Reagan announced the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, the government compromised their stance and power by apologizing and acknowledging their faults. But on a national scale, the decision to sacrifice people's rights in the name of national security set a dangerous precedent where the president could justify unconstitutional policies by claiming the country was in danger. People all across the nation saw how this issue was becoming a larger problem, one where the government overruled several Supreme Court cases on constitutional values.
When the camps were dissolved, they affected internees for many years after, and how they raised their children. We were raised in a very strict environment, and it was very important to not cause any shame to the Japanese American community. They also didn't push us to learn the Japanese language so that we wouldn't differentiate ourselves from our Caucasian friends. In essence, it was important for us to blend in with American mainstream. Because internees are impacted by the effects of the camps, they changed their perspectives and beliefs on how to raise their children. After the internment experience, many people felt empowered to speak up against other civil injustices.
Yeah, we talk about it a lot because we don't want this to happen to anybody ever again, the way it happened to us.
The internment is also relevant to our lives today, as it can be compared to recent controversies regarding race and religion. Many former internees agree and now have more motivation to share their experiences with others.
And I didn't like to speak up in front of groups, but I do now because I feel that it was a terrible wrong. I think that the climate today is like it was back then, because they have people speaking about incarcerating others in the same. In fact, they point out what happened to the Japanese Americans as an example of what can be done.
Overall, the government's decision to intern the Japanese Americans created large conflict, but also instances of compromise. The lives of almost all Japanese Americans were affected by the internment, whether it be directly or indirectly, and the opinions and points of view of various groups helped give former internees an authority to speak up about their experiences and stand up against similar ones happening today.